Ciaphas Cain, pronounced Ciaphas Cain, was a commissar of the Officio Prefectus who was assigned to service with the Astra Militarum and who was eventually hailed as one of the greatest heroes of the Imperium of Man. He was in active service during the last century of the 41st millennium and was over 200 Terran years old when he was recalled into service during the 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler. It is certain that he survived more than a quarter of a standard century into the 42nd millennium. Imperial propaganda made him out to be a great hero of the Imperium in the 41st millennium, although in truth, by his own admission, he was primarily focused on his own survival during his long career. However, Cain differed from many other Imperial commissars in that he would not readily sacrifice his soldiers unless it ensured his own survival, and he had no interest in carrying out the savage discipline for which so many commissars were known. Cain tried his utmost to avoid engaging in actual combat, but usually was required to do so to maintain his status as a hero of the Imperium, which ironically would involve him in more dangerous situations than any he would usually have seen as a simple commissar. He often found himself trapped by his own excuses, uncovering the worst dangers of all in the very places he sought safety in. He was responsible for many successful campaigns throughout his career and retired to become an instructor for new Imperial commissars at a Schola Progenium. He eventually died of old age and was buried with full honors as a hero of the Imperium. Despite his death and state funeral at some point in the Era Indomitus, Cain is still officially listed on active duty by the Officio Prefectus. Due to repeated instances of Cain turning up alive when reports of his death were already fully entrenched in administratum records, as in the wake of his crash landing on Perlia, the Departamento Munitorum eventually issued standing orders that he should be kept on the active roster at all times, no matter what reports anyone received to the contrary. As the Imperium does not make mistakes, Cain is always officially listed on active duty. In the early 42nd millennium, Cain's private memoirs were published amongst the ranks of the Inquisition. They were sequestered by order of the Inquisition and were kept and organized as the Cain Archive by Ordo Xenos Inquisitor Amberley Vale, with whom Cain had many encounters over his career and shared a close working and personal relationship. Vale edited Cain's chaotic notes and, using information from additional sources, such as the memoirs of Valhallan General Genit Sula, published 101. M42 made available, for the internal use only of the Inquisition, first-person accounts of several Cain missions, often annotated by herself. It is worth noting, as Inquisitor Vale did in footnotes throughout the memoirs, that Cain was a skilled liar and dissembler. However, his narrative is refreshingly honest concerning his shortcomings, and even, according to Vale, overly modest in recording his victories against the enemies of the Imperium. The Cain Archive was no intentional memoir. Cain apparently wrote it solely to organize his own thoughts, and indeed expected that whatever Inquisitor found it after his death would expunge the whole document. It should not be confused with his official public memoir, To Serve the Emperor, A Commissar's Life. Inquisitor Vale noted that the latter was not only far less candid than the private Cain Archive, but comparatively poorly written to boot. Cain makes numerous mentions of his homeworld, apparently a hive world, though he never mentions a name or any feature which could lead to it being identified. Inquisitor Amberley Vale speculated that Cain may not in fact know the name of his own homeworld. However, he shows a definite affinity for underground passages and has a natural sense of direction when underground. He claimed that his parents were killed by Crute while serving together in the Astra Militarum, which is why he was sent to be trained as a commissar. However, it has not been stated in which regiment they served, and no hive world in the nearby sectors is known to have fielded mixed-gender regiments in the appropriate time frame. Additionally, Cain claims his parents were petty criminals who joined the Astra Militarum to avoid arrest, but this does not explain how their son was admitted to a Schola Progenium, a privilege usually reserved for the orphan children of senior officers or decorated imperial heroes who were killed in the Emperor's service. Cain's record at the Schola Progenium, where he was educated and trained, shows that his marks were on the low end of average in everything save sports and combat training. He also had a clean disciplinary record, however. This probably means he didn't get caught that often in bad behavior. Throughout his service in the Officio Prefectus Commissariat, Cain seems to have served predominantly with regiments raised from the ice world of Valhalla. He picked up a number of their habits and slang terms, although he never became enamored of the cold they enjoyed or their habit of taking showers in ice water. His loyal aide Ferric Jürgen was a Valhallan guardsman who happened to be a psychic blank and served Cain faithfully for many standard years. Also with him was future General Genit Sula, early in her career. She was a lieutenant in most of the published extracts from the Cain Archive, later promoted to captain. Cain began his service as a commissar with the Valhallan 12th Field Artillery in 919. Mem 41, apparently as a commissar attached to the command battery, but soon took up duties over the entire regiment. His first taste of battle came in 919. M41 was on the world of Desolatia, where the regiment had been defending against an assault by orcs, but soon they were faced with a Tyrannid Splinter Hive fleet, which they held out against until an Imperial Navy fleet arrived to pick up the Imperial forces remaining on the planet. During the Tyrannid landing, Cain attempted outright desertion in a commandeered salamander, only to run directly into a previously unnoticed flanking force, including a hive tyrant. His panicked contact report and desperate retreat back to the lines were misinterpreted, according to his own account, as a heroically successful scouting mission and baiting maneuver, painting the first strokes of his grand reputation. Cain and his regiment's next destination was the planet of Kephia, where he spent a restful few years of the decade of the 920 SM-41, and the only major battle he participated in was assisting the local enforcers, calling themselves Custodes, though the title is unrelated to the Adeptus Custodes of the same name, in revealing a Genestealer infestation in the sector and assisting in the defense of the Custodes headquarters. From Kephia, Cain went in 924. Mem 41 to the world of Perlia, where he was first earmarked for greater things. After a space battle, he and his adjutant Jürgen were left isolated on the ground of Perlia, presumed dead after their escape pod crashed behind orc lines. From there, he raised an army of freed slaves and PDF survivors, and in what became known as the March of the Liberator, successfully fought his way through the orcs to the Imperial front line, killing the orc warlord personally. The Imperial forces took the opportunity to attack the remaining orc forces, who were in disarray. On the world of Slockenberg, Cain and 3 guardsmen were nearly seduced by a chaos sorceress whilst accompanying scouts, but managed to destroy the enemy position with artillery. From there, Cain was assigned to commissariat command for a few years, which was at first a simple desk job, but his reputation meant that he was sent on risky missions. These included a trip in 928. M41 to Interitus Prime, a Necron tomb world, Viridia and Viridia Secundus, the cleansing of a space hulk, campaigns against the craft world Aeldari, the cleansing of the world of Sanguia, and the campaign to reclaim Archipelaga. He survived these campaigns purely by being able to keep his head down and commonly being the only survivor. Before long, he requested transfer back to a full regiment since it seemed to be less dangerous work. Of these experiences, Cain notes that his encounter with the Necrons was the most horrific and left the most lasting impression on him. Currently, the majority of extracts available from the Cain Archive tell of his time serving with the 597th Valhallan Regiment. While serving with that regiment, Cain appears to have been very close to the troopers, particularly with the senior officers with which he had a personal friendship. This bond is only natural. Cain himself can be said to be responsible for founding the regiment in 931. M41, which was comprised of the combined remains of the 301st and 296th Valhallan regiments. One was an all-male frontline assault regiment, and the other was an all-female rear-echelon garrison regiment. Designated the 296th/301 St. Valhallan Regiment, they had a deep and bitter resentment of each other, which escalated into a cafeteria riot which left a few regiment members and a few transport void ship's crewmen dead. Cain took steps and petitioned the administratum to allow the regiment to be renamed the 597th Valhallan Regiment, which was the sum of 296 plus 301, a name symbolic of their origins, while also enforcing the unity of the combined regiment. He insisted on mixing troopers from both regiments in every squad and instituted a few rewards for good behavior and performance, practices which turned it into an unified and disciplined force and remained traditional even after he moved on from the regiment. Cain was present with the 597th Valhallan Regiment of the Astra Militarum for their first action during the Gravellax incident of 931. M41, where he was awarded the Order of Merit of Gravellax Second Class for his part in preventing the Tau Empire's annexation of the planet Gravellax on the eastern fringes of the Imperium. Cain was to joke in later years that if he had allowed the Tau to kill Governor Grice, the grateful populace would have given him the first-class decoration. In truth, the planet had been infested by a Genestealer cult that had been trying to spark off a meaningless war over a backwater planet between the Tau and the Imperium in order to distract them both from the approach of a Tyrannid hive fleet. It was during this affair that Cain first encountered Inquisitor Amberly Vale, and also discovered that his aide Jurgen was in fact a psychic blank, a trait which saved Cain's life as he dueled the Genestealer Patriarch. The campaign concluded with the death of Governor Grice, revealed to be a member of the cult, at the hands of Inquisitor Vale, and the withdrawal of Tau military assets from Gravellax. A year later, in 932. M41, Cain served on the world of Simia Orichalkai, defending a refinery against orc predations and an awakening Necron threat beneath the ice. Shortly after this, in 933, M41, he was sent to the planet Periremunda in the wake of a civil uprising. It was discovered that Genestealers were behind the uprising and had already attracted the attention of a Tyrannid splinter fleet. After many hard-fought battles, the infection was finally cleansed, and a rogue Inquisitor neutralized in the bargain. After fighting the Xenos Hrud on Skekwi and Orcs on Castafor, Cain arrived at Adumbria in 937. M41, where he assisted in uncovering a chaos ritual and defending against landing chaos forces. His actions defeated a demon prince and prevented the transformation of the planet into a demon world. He was later court-martialed, an action initiated by Commissar Thomas Beige for leaving the front line on Adumbria to attack the site of the demon prince's summoning. But Cain was cleared of all wrongdoing, and Beige was charged himself for obstructing Cain's activities. Beige was later acquitted after Cain testified that Beige was incompetent but did mean well and was attempting to perform his duties as he believed them to be. The Valhallan 597th was called on in 938. M41 to help with the pacification of Lentonia. They arrived as the battle took a new and sinister form. A strange plague was sweeping through the Astra Militarum and locals alike, and those killed by it would rise from their graves to attack the still living. Attempts to create a vaccine worked in laboratory settings, but failed when used on the infected. Cain happened to notice that a cut Jurgen had suffered from one revenant had healed completely, when less severe wounds inflicted by their claws festered in others. Cain realized that there was both a physical and warp factor to the unnatural plague, and that Jurgen's blank nature had blocked the second factor, allowing him to heal normally. At Cain's suggestion, some vaccine was blessed by a hierophant of the ecclesiarchy and then proved fully effective. While carrying blessed vaccine to be placed in artillery shells for use against the revenants, Cain and Jurgen encountered the Nurglite Chaos Cult, controlling the revenants and destroyed them in 942. M41 Cain and the Valhallan 597th were tasked with suppressing an orc outbreak on Nusquam Fundamentibus, a remote ice world outside of major warp routes, where Cain had been on a mission 2 solar decades earlier. While pursuing the action against the orcs, Cain discovered the presence of a Tyrannid swarm that had been hibernating for millennia, likely since pre-imperial times, certainly long before the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth in the planet's permafrost, carried over by a crashed hive ship. The swarm was partially awakened by the action on the planet, but the hive mind was destroyed before it could become fully operational, largely due to Cain's efforts. In the mid-900 SM-41, Cain left regimental service to become the commissarial liaison officer on Lord General Zyvan's staff. As with his earlier command posting, it wasn't quite the routine desk job he was hoping for. In 990, M41, Tau sympathizers in the Deepwater system would have destroyed Zyvan's flagship with the Lord General on board had Cain not intervened. In 991, M41, Cain accompanied reinforcements to Quadrividia, then under attack by the Tau, and was present when the Tau requested a truce to deal with Hive Fleet Kraken. Cain then accompanied Zyvan and a Tau emissary to Fecundia to coordinate that world's defenses. An undated fragment from the Cain archive may fall in this time period as well, or maybe from one of the occasions when he was pulled out of retirement during the Tyrannic Wars. Cain was forced into a temporary alliance with a Drukhari succubus when a Tyrannid force attacked the world both were on. The succubus attempted to capture Cain to boost her own standing in her cult, but he outwitted her in the resulting duel and slew her. He then ordered an airstrike to destroy the webway portal the witch cult had used to reach the planet. Cain's actions on the world of Perlia would come back to haunt him on 2 occasions during the 80 standard years between the first and second sieges of that planet. The first occurred during the campaign on Para Ramonda, when Cain discovered that the Ordo Xenos and the Adeptus Mechanicus had been working on a secret project surrounding an artifact known as the Shadow Light. This unusual artifact, which predated the existence of mankind itself, activated the powers of latent psychers and boosted the powers of already active ones. The Shadow Light had been contained in a secret Mechanicus shrine located within the hydroelectric dam in the Valley of Demons on Perlia's eastern continent, until it was stolen by a rogue tech priest named Matthias in the employ of Inquisitor Killian of the Ordo Hereticus. When Cain arrived at the dam, shortly before destroying it, flooding the valley and drowning thousands of orcs, he found that the tech priests of the shrine had been killed with surgical precision only solar weeks before. He learned standard years later that this had been the work of Killian and Matthias, Killian having co-opted the services of an Adeptus Sororitas force to raid the shrine. Killian had allied with a number of chaos cults on Para Ramonda and intended to use the Shadow Light to boost their psychic powers, turning them into servants of the Emperor without them realizing it. His ultimate plan was to use the Shadow Light to create an army of psychers powerful enough to storm the Eye of Terror and take the fight to the forces of chaos on their own ground, a plan that another psycher deemed could potentially have caused the destruction of the galaxy. At Inquisitor Amberly Vale's behest, Cain assisted in tracking Killian down to his lair at an Adepta Sororitas convent on Para Ramunda. Having already made several attempts to assassinate Cain, Killian tried to win the Commissar over as an ally, but upon learning of Killian's deranged plans and discovering he was using a captive lictor to lure in a nearby Tyrannid swarm to cover his tracks, uncaring of the civilian casualties his escape plan would incur, Cain refused him and a firefight broke out. In the confusion, Jurgen grabbed the Shadow Light, and Killian, unaware Jurgen was a psychic blank, made the mistake of assuming Cain or the Mechanicus had found a way to deactivate the device. He seized the Shadow Light from Jurgen and attempted to make a break for it, only to be fatally exposed to its full power once he was out of range of Jurgen's abilities. Matthias, who was accompanying Killian, was later killed by Tyrannid gargoyles during the evacuation of the convent before Vale called in an orbital bombardment to exterminate the Tyrannids. After Killian's death, the Shadow Light was returned to Perlia in the shrine set in the rebuilt dam in the Valley of Demons, where it would remain for another 60 standard years. The other occasion when Cain's actions on Perlia would come back to haunt him was during the Second Siege of Perlia in 999. M41. Cain had by that time retired and made Perlia his home, teaching at a schola progenium on the western continent in a mountainous village near the planetary capital of Havensdown. Meeting with the rogue trader Aurelius, whom he had met on Gravilax, Cain discovered that there was a chaos force headed in the direction of Perlia, having overrun 2 neighboring star systems. It was Cain's suspicion, and Inquisitor Vale's as well, as she had sent Aurelius to meet with Cain, that the Chaos Horde and their leader, War Master Varen the Undefeatable, had their sights set on the acquisition of the Shadowlight artifact, potentially either at the behest of Abaddon the Despoiler or to gain his favor. Called once again to defend Perlia, Cain coordinated with the commanders of the planetary and system defense forces, appearing in picked casts calling for civilians to join the militia, and leading attacks against Chaos insurgents, culminating in a final showdown with War Master Varan himself. Though Cain succeeded in killing Varan and effectively ending the second siege of Perlia, the Shadowlight was taken by a Necron scouting party, presumably to destroy it, as Psykers were the most potent weapons that could be used against the Necrons. From the Necrons' actions, Cain and Amberly Vale theorized that the Shadowlight may have been built by the Old Ones in order to combat the Necrons, who had a documented fear of the warp and psychic powers. While not an ideal resolution, Cain and Vale concluded that if the Necrons had feared the Shadowlight so, they likely had no plans to use it against the Imperium, which made it preferable for the artifact to be in their hands, rather than those of the forces of Chaos. Cain spent the years after his service during the 13th Black Crusade in say 999. M41 teaching at the Schola Progenium on Perlia and writing his memoirs, both his public memoir, To Serve the Emperor, A Commissar's Life, and the secret Cain archive that Inquisitor Vale distributed among her colleagues. Cain presumably died sometime in the 1st or 2nd century of the 42nd millennium, and is the only person in the known galaxy to remain on the active duty roster of the Astra Militarum even after being buried with full military honors. This is the result of a confusion in the records of the Departamento Munitorum during the first siege of Perlia, in which Cain was listed as killed in action until some point after he rejoined his regiment at the campaign's end. This pattern of returning alive after being declared dead occurred often enough during Cain's career that the Munitorum made a special ruling that Ciaphas Cain is to never be considered dead, despite evidence to the contrary. It is interesting to note that there is a small sect in the Talern Desert Raiders regiments of the Astra Militarum who consider Cain to have been a physical conduit of the Emperor's divine will. There even exists a religious text of the imperial cult dedicated to Cain, called the Book of Cain. This was written by Alam Mahat, a trooper who accompanied Commissar Beige in his misguided attempt to arrest Cain. Mahat witnessed Cain's defiance and defeat of the demon prince Emili, whose mere presence brought even Chaos Space Marines to heel, and like most people he failed to understand Ferric Jurgen's contribution to Cain's victory since he was a psychic blank. Although Cain performed acts in his long commissarial service that were nothing short of heroic, they were always, by his own admission, done reluctantly. He chose his first posting with the Valhallan 12th Field Artillery specifically to avoid frontline combat, as artillery regiments generally remained at the rear of any Imperial army. After the events on Desolatia, however, Cain often made the observation that his commanders were bent on sending him into deadly situations simply on the basis of his reputation. The first thing on his mind was always his own safety and how he would be able to escape the situation he was in. Despite his reluctance to participate in combat, Cain was by no means unprepared for it, as one of the things he focused on while at the Schola Progenium, in addition to sports, was combat training. Cain was described as an exceptional swordsman who even had the respect of the Adeptus Astartes, a skill which undoubtedly came from the sort of combat experience no amount of practice could emulate, in the words of Inquisitor Amberly Vale, though he still practiced his techniques anyway. In his memoirs, Cain described his chainsword skill as a habitual and instinctive one. On at least 2 occasions, a rival commissar backed down from a proffered duel with Cain upon taking in the battered and hard-used condition of his chainsword. He was also skilled enough with a las pistol to accurately hit his target well beyond the weapon's accepted operational range, even against Necron warriors. Most images of him, however, incorrectly depict him wielding a bolt pistol, a weapon he considered impressively destructive but too ammunition-hungry to rely upon. Cain's upbringing in an underhive left him with an instinctive affinity for underground spaces. He could resolve three-dimensional maps at a glance, and had a keen sense of direction that kept him oriented while traversing labyrinthine corridors. He could also navigate and even fight in complete darkness, making use of his hearing and other senses. The one exception to Cain's habit of trying to avoid combat was when sorcery was involved. If he became aware of a sorcerer or sorceress chaos cult in his theater of operations, he always resolutely hunted down and eliminated these heretics as soon as possible. However, in his memoirs, Cain described this drive as neither bravery nor zeal, but simply a belief that there is no outrunning the horrors that successful sorcery can produce. The only way to really be safe from warpcraft is to find and exterminate those who would wield it before their plans bear fruit. Though he rose to a level of accomplishment and seniority that would easily justify the title of Lord Commissar, Cain disdained the term and refused to be addressed by it. While Cain believed in the divinity of the Emperor of Mankind, he thought him a distant deity, far too busy with galactic-scale concerns to look out for the welfare of any individual worshipper. He had little patience for the overly pious, such as Battle Sisters and certain fellow commissars, finding such emperor botherers unpleasantly humorless and self-righteous. Even worse, he considered them dangerously prone to tactical idiocy based on what they imagined to be holy commandments. However, Cain did hold that certain problems were the rightful purview of priests. He was also fond of the writings of Saint Amelia, which struck a compassionate, understanding tone that he appreciated. Cain had a great degree of social acumen, which he used throughout his career to reinforce his public image as a hero of the Imperium. His deep grasp of practical human psychology led him to be much more lax about discipline than he would have been within his rights to be as a commissar. The cold, acclimated Valhallan soldiers, for example, were allowed some leniency in their dress as a concession to the uncomfortable temperatures they experienced in non-freezing climes. Cain always tried to find a way around executing soldiers and preferred to give friendly warnings rather than outright punishments. Cain admits this was to cultivate popularity and give the guardsmen incentive to try to keep him alive. Whatever the reason, Cain's regiments tended to have high morale without necessarily compromising discipline or combat effectiveness.